So now we move on to two final speakers. Dr. Phil Baker, who's going to speak to us from normally in Melbourne, but he's actually, I think, over in the main island at the moment in New Zealand. So Phil is a research fellow at the Institute for Physical Activity Nutrition at Deakin University, Australia. He's a senior lecturer in food policy and international nutrition, with PhD from my university, Australian National University, which is where I know him from. We've had a great research partnership over the years, and today continues it. So over to you, Phil.
Thank you so much, as always, Julie, and it's an absolute pleasure to speak tonight on this topic of transformative change in first food systems and how the mother's milk tool could be levered for achieving such transformation. Also to speak with alongside so many wonderful speakers who have really pioneered research in this area, including Julie, who has just done so much fabulous work in this area. And also I just want to say a huge congratulations to Julie, Alessandro, Roger, and others at the team at Alive and Thrive for this fantastic collaboration that you've put together to produce such a wonderful tool. And what's really special for me tonight is seeing individual mothers and women, sharing their own estimates. And I have not come across an international tool of this nature where that is directly engages at that individual level. So this is, I think, a remarkable achievement, and not just in terms of the tool itself, but also in how, in terms of who it engages. So I'm really going to talk about this. I'm a food systems researcher. Most of my research focuses on this question of what does it mean to transform the food system, and how do we transform the food system to reach health and sustainability objectives. And as many of you will know, this has been very high on the international agenda. As Roger mentioned earlier, we recently had a United Nations Food Systems Summit. But what's really evident about the attention this topic of food systems is getting is the huge number of reports that are being published, almost week after week for several years. There was a report published, and now we have over 70, I think it's almost 80 reports by international organizations that focus on this question of how do we transform the food system, including by all the major UN nutrition agencies. So a very much topical issue. Now, the definition of a sustainable food system, in my opinion, puts the term future generations as core to that very definition. So one that ensures food security and nutrition for all in such a way that the economic, social, and environmental bases to generate food security and nutrition of future generations are not compromised. So it is for the unborn children and the children alive today for whom we are doing this work of transforming food systems for sustainability. And this was where I think the Mother's Milk tool can make a major contribution in changing how we think about and how we value the way we feed our future generations. We've recently published, if you're interested in this topic of what does it mean to transform a system, what does it mean to transform a food system, we recently published this paper which analyzed the recommendations of these reports for their transformative potential. And this could potentially help to inform thinking on how we transform first food systems. Which brings me to this slide here. Breastfeeding is a major form of global food production, and infant and young child feeding as women's care work is often ignored in food systems dialogues, research, and action. And many of us really tried to hammer home this point during the UN Food Systems Summit. In the work we've done, we've defined first food systems as the food systems that provision foods for infants and young children and that structure feeding practices at the population level. This is a very deliberate framing because in framing something as determined by a system, we shift the focus away from individual mothers and we end the blame. And I think this is, for me, the very core motivation of the work that we are doing in this area. And also, I know very much the work that Julie has done for decades and that the Alive and Thrive team, FHI 360 team are doing as well. These are some of the papers we've published on this topic of first food systems. And I'd like to draw your attention to the wonderful policy brief done by FHI Solutions, Alive and Thrive, and Save the Children team members, which introduce this concept and in particular give the importance of breastfeeding in food systems. Now, we cannot talk about the frame we've been using is that sustainable food systems begin with a mother-child breastfeeding diet, because it is really the breastfeeding woman where the food system begins. We've framed the diet as a first food system in and of itself. It is an on-demand global food production system and arguably the shortest food supply chain on earth, unparalleled in safety. Delivers optimal nutrients and immunological factors, which we know evolve from feed to feed, day to day, responding to the child's evolving developmental needs. And we know the remarkable difference that that universal breastfeeding could make in terms of saving children's lives and preventing unnecessary illness. But it's also vitally important to note that no other form of food production or food delivery is packaged with love in the same way that breastfeeding is, and the remarkable effects that it has in terms of mother-child bonding, reducing stress for the infants, and in a, you know, what is ultimately an expression of love. But what does it mean to transform a system? So in our work, we describe the first food system as comprising many different elements. The mother-child breastfeeding diet itself, but also first food environments, the context, the settings in which mothers and women feed children, supply chains, policy, governance, and regulatory frameworks, and also factors of political economy, power, the role of the food industry, the role of governments, civil society, advocacy groups, women's groups, and how these also shape first food systems. Essentially, what we are talking about here is a non-linear approach to intervening in a system. If we wish to transform food systems and first food systems to realize goals like universal breastfeeding, realizing goals like realizing the rights of mothers, infants, and children, then this, many of us believe, is the approach we need to take. Now, an approach that we sort of adopt from biomedical thinking is the one on the left, a linear approach that where you intervene, you get some change, and the outcome results. It black boxes the system. On the right, you have systems thinking concept. The concept of systems thinking, where the intervention it could be a policy or program. In this case, the mother's milk tool has many effects. It has dynamic effects involving feedback loops and non-linearity. So I think this is a really important, and yeah, there are multiple pathways to a particular outcome that we desire. Now, when we think about how we intervene in systems, there has been some really groundbreaking work done by our colleagues in environmental science. Donella Meadows was the pioneer, one of the pioneers of systems thinking, really informed by ecological studies. This is one of the frameworks that is often used when we ask the question of understanding systems change. Systems are understood as comprising multiple components. From the bottom, we have system elements, and as we work our way up, we get to the goals of the system and the paradigm that underpins the system. Now, one of the challenges that systems thinking, or one of the ways that systems thinking helps us to understand change in systems, is that the higher we go up this pyramid of interventions, the potential for impact becomes much greater. But so does the difficulty, because it is hard to change a paradigm. It is hard to change people's mental models. It is hard to change people's ideologies. And it is hard to change the fundamental goals of a system. As Malvina said earlier, we are essentially the dominant operating economic system, political economic system in the world today is capitalism and neoliberal capitalism. And the goals of this system are often at odds with things like breastfeeding. Now, when we talk about there's another way of understanding systems change is in terms of orders of change. At a third order change is just to completely transform the system. The second order is to reform the system. And first order change is to adjust the system. Now, most of the interventions that we talk about with infant and young child feeding are in the level of the first order change. And they really are about changing systems elements, removing formula samples from hospitals, banning labels comparing formula of breast milk, and mass media campaigns to promote breastfeeding. These are important, but together they can, across an entire system, if there's enough of these interventions, they can generate significant effects. But if we want to really start to reform the system, we need to actually change things like system structures, like removing the baby food industry from governance and from policy, for example. Establish very robust national infant and young child feeding, monitoring and enforcement systems. For example, ensuring that code violations do not go unnoticed nor unpunished. But if we wish to transform the system, that is something entirely different again. Here we must talk about prioritizing the rights of mothers and children over corporate profits and trade. This is about the paradigm and the goals of the system, moving away from a purely biomedical model of health professional training, and crucially, as many people have spoken tonight, making women's work visible and valued in economic decision-making. So what does it mean to challenge the paradigm in this space, and how can the Mother's Milk tool really help us to get there? Well, as I've really here just repeating what others have already said tonight, and building on the work of Marilyn and Julie and others who have really been the pioneers in this space. First of all, is valuing breastfeeding as a form of care work and non-market form of non-market house production, which is too often invisible to economic decision makers. As many have said tonight, baby food sales get counted in national accounting systems, contributing to GDP. However, the immense value that breastfeeding women and mothers render society is typically invisible. And the Mother's Milk tool clearly can play a huge role here when combined with advocacy, when combined with rights-based arguments. This has immense potential. The frame that sits behind this all, of course, is that current economic output measures, including GDP, current ways of thinking about what it means for a society to be successful, are dominated by a market model and a very reductionist economic form of profit-driven economics. And this is strongly biased against women's productive health and economic rights. It is manifest in the fact that so many women worldwide lack effective maternity protection and are illegally entitled to cash benefits, especially in countries with large informal sectors. Another area where I think the tool could really help is to raise priority, generate attention to the economic value of breastfeeding in international fora. Our recent work, much of it led by Katie Russ, reports on the way in which corporations, the baby food industry, and governments supporting the baby food industry, including Australia, the United States, New Zealand, have intervened in the World Trade Organization against other countries attempting to implement their national milk code, or attempting to implement the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes international law. This has largely been invisible, and only recently has it been reported on. This is essentially governments giving priority to the baby food industry over the rights of mothers, infants, and children. This figure shows the number of interventions, the countries making the interventions, and the countries at which those interventions are against. And you can see there have been substantial numbers of them over the last few decades. On the right, you can see the number of interest groups representing governments in the Codex Committee that develops the standards for infant formula and follow-up formula. Not only do we see food industry groups as part of country delegations to the Codex, but sometimes we see the country delegation is only industry. So there is clearly a very strong skew towards commercial interest at Codex. And we are very lucky to have at least some civil society representation in that fora. But again, the Mother's Milk tool, by raising, generating attention to the economic value of breast milk, I think can help to really inform dialogues in some of these fora. The other area where we see this huge undervaluation of breastfeeding is through its exclusion from national and international food monitoring systems. And Anne spoke about this earlier. Julie mentioned that Norway is the exception worldwide in recognizing breastfeeding as part of its national food statistics. Food systems are strongly gendered. Women are responsible for half of the world's agricultural production, and some in many countries produce over 3/4 of food, of all food. Breastfeeding is a crucial food source, providing between 35 to 40% of the child's energy needs at 12 to 23 months. At current breastfeeding rates, as Julie mentioned earlier, according to the Mother's Milk tool, this equates to 21.9 billion litres of breast milk produced by mothers every year worldwide. And yet this is not seen as a form of food production. It is invisible in national food balance sheets, in international food monitoring systems. And it's also remarkable that world production is at least twice this figure, given less than half of children are currently meeting the WHO recommendations. So I think the Mother's Milk tool could also play an immense role in generating systems-wide change by demonstrating the economic value and productive value of breastfeeding. Thank you very much.
Wow, that gave us the big picture. It really did. And Phil has been doing some fantastic work in this area that really shows us in very stark terms the political economy of mother's milk and breastfeeding.